World history. This lecture is all about new imperialism, one of our topics of our 19th century studies. What is imperialism? It is the domination by one country of the political, economic, and social life of another. If you do not know what PES stands for, I suggest you write it out. But PES, political, economic, and social life of another. It is sometimes referred to as colonialism or colonization. We'll talk about the differences of those words when we're in class together, but I would include those just so you recognize them later. And really, if it's new imperialism, it means that there was old imperialism. And old imperialism, which isn't really a term, but just for our sake, I will say that, started in the 1500s with the Age of Exploration, with places like Spain and Portugal, with the help of people like Christopher Columbus coming across, discovering, so to speak, the new land of the Americas and taking over. But you can see about 400 years later, it looks a little bit different. At this point, new imperialism is when European nations and later the US and Japan took control of other countries worldwide. Okay, and as you can see, almost the entire world ends up under the control of either Europe, the US, or Japan. So why did this happen? Let's get into it. First of all, the causes. If we think back to the Age of Exploration, we know that our causes were the three G's: God, glory, and gold. Arguably, the three main reasons for new imperialism kind of match that. So if we think of the idea of gold, it was just that idea that if you can control trade and you can build wealth, that will contribute to building your empire. And so the first cause of new imperialism was also economic. As the Industrial Revolution and capitalism took hold of Europe, European nations wanted the colonies' natural resources for their raw materials. If you're going to make textiles, you're going to make shirts and pants out of cotton or out of cloth, you need the cotton. If your country doesn't produce cotton itself, you're going to go take over a colony or take over a land where you can get cotton, and that becomes your colony. Okay, we'll get into how you take it over in just a second. But these European countries would take over colonies for access to their raw materials, also known as their natural resources. Then those natural resources would usually be shipped back to the mother country, where they would go into a factory or manufacturing setting and be turned into finished products. Then they would be shipped back to the colonized people, the people who lived in that colony, and that is who would be the built-in market for these products or the manufactured goods. Sometimes this was taken to an extreme where the colonized people were only allowed to purchase products of that mother country. But other times that mother country would just put tariffs on foreign products so high that those products would be unaffordable. Either way, it guaranteed that dominant country with a guaranteed customer base. That's what I'm trying to say. The next major cause is political. There was the nationalistic feeling that every European country was superior or better to every other country. And so in order to stay competitive and fulfill that nationalistic feeling, these empires needed to build and build and build. So there was a competitive drive to build a strong empire to make one's country stronger than another country, specifically the European powers fighting with each other to be the strongest or have the most power. Each country's military, some inventions of new weapons and transportation were used to overtake the Africans, where the Africans couldn't fight back because they didn't have the weaponry, they didn't have the ease of transportation or the force of the military of some of these more powerful European countries. So this, in a nutshell, is a big reason why this happened, because the European power was superior and the Africans, to an extent, didn't stand a chance. And so the European powers were looking for more control because that more control gave them more power. The more power they had, the more control that they could wield. Then there were social causes. This is a little bit more like the God part of our three G's. And sure enough, that was yet again a motivating factor for something that happened in world history, was to spread religion. And missionaries believed it was their moral duty to spread Christianity to other corners of the world, including Asia and Africa and India. And so in addition to the missionaries coming to these countries or these lands to try to influence the religious and cultural beliefs of the people, the Europeans also started to believe in social Darwinism, which, piggybacking off of the idea of Charles Darwin in evolution, that it's the survival of the fittest animal species, humans started to believe, or at least Europeans started to believe, that if they were able to take over the Africans or the Indians or the Asian people, that was because they were racially superior, and that was kind of the natural order of things, that their race was the fittest race. The more humanitarian twist on it was that white people had the responsibility to teach the inferior people to be more refined or proper, or teach them their manners and their style of dress and their language and the ways to read and write of the European people. So essentially it was the white man's burden to help improve these other people. Obviously extremely racist policies and mindset as the Europeans took over these other countries. There are two types of imperialism we're going to focus on. To an extent, there's a third. We'll refer to that later. But the first type is colonial rule, and the second type is a protectorate. In a colonial rule setting, a mother country is governing a colony just like it's a province of itself. So one type of way of doing this is direct rule. For example, when the British took over the American colonies, they would actually send British officials, Europeans, to America to govern there. So the European officials themselves were in charge of this land. They would actually go there and control things. In indirect rule, the European power would negotiate to find local rulers who would be loyal to them, and then those local rulers who were still responsible to that European power, but those local rulers would be in charge. And part of the idea was that maybe they'd be more accepted because they were from the native population. In some cases, this worked, especially because the local rulers wanted the power and the wealth that came along with it. But in some cases, the local rulers basically faked their loyalty and then ran things in their native land how they wanted, while still needing to do enough to make the mother country believe that they were in charge, specifically by giving them tax money. But that's a little bit of a tangent. And so one example of direct rule, as I said, when the British were ruling over the American colonies. An example of indirect rule is when the Dutch were ruling over the East Indies or the islands of Indonesia. Those were local rulers who answered to the Dutch. And then there are protectorates, and these are lands where the local rulers were allowed to rule, but were expected to follow the advice and policies of the European power. There's no gray area about it. The United States still has several of these, including places like Puerto Rico and Guam. Okay, the first major event of new imperialism that we're going to focus on was the Scramble for Africa. At this time, the European nations were competing for control of the entire African continent, because if one power, like let's say the French, gained control of a land with really strong or really bountiful natural resources, well, that just made another power, let's say the British, want the same thing. This happened to such an extent that pretty soon the entire continent of Africa is controlled by European powers, with two exceptions. Those two exceptions are Ethiopia and Liberia. They were able to stay independent. We will go over why in class. But meanwhile, the European powers, recognizing this conflict, wanted to find a way to settle this issue without going into yet another European war. And so Otto von Bismarck of Germany organized the Berlin Conference, and he gathered the major European powers for a meeting where they would each claim African colonies without fighting. Sounds great, right? Sounds peaceful, right? Well, what they did is they drew lines on the maps of Africa without knowledge of the native people and what that might do to them. And so this resulted in breaking apart cultural groups, linguistic groups, tribes, putting communities together that had longstanding rivalries, which is a little bit interesting given the fact that Germany and Italy had just become unified nations themselves. Again, something we can talk about in class, kind of a side note there. Maybe you can imagine, maybe this comes as no surprise, that no Africans were invited or took part in the decisions of how this would be done. And so this creates these divisions with long-standing effects, even some that could be traced to problems that some African nations face today. Take a quick look at this political cartoon. This is the idea that this is Otto von Bismarck and that all the European powers are gathered to split up Africa, no different than a pie or a cake. And then these graphs show you the extent in which Africa goes from being completely free in 1850, or nearly completely free, to almost completely taken over by Europe by 1914. This map shows you a little bit more of what I was talking about. In the late 1700s, we have all sorts of governing bodies throughout Africa. Very few of them, though, are European powers, except kind of up in the north. But by 1914, almost the entire continent is taken over by European powers. Okay, we're going to look at two different case studies, I guess, if you could say, about imperialism in Africa. And the first area we're going to focus on is South Africa, specifically the South African Boer Wars. So in the 1600s, a little background before we get into this, in the 1600s, the Dutch established a trading post in South Africa called Cape Colony. So this was a trade post and a stopping point for Dutch traders and explorers and merchants as they went from Europe under the southern tip of Africa over to the Spice Islands and back again. And since this starts in the 1600s, by the time the 1800s, the 19th century rolls around, this group of people had been there for so long that they now consider themselves their own ethnic group. They no longer felt like they were European, but they also didn't necessarily feel like they were African. So they were European, they were people who were of European descent, so their roots traced back to being Dutch or German or French, primarily Dutch. They called themselves the Boers, or they also called themselves the Afrikaners. So they weren't quite African either. Well, at some point in all of this, gold and diamonds, and it's a detailed story, I could tell you more if you want later, but gold and diamonds were found in South Africa. Well, you better believe that that became a hot property, and the British come in and force the Boers into certain states, and then they maintain control in certain states. And oh yes, both of these groups had to fight native tribes to leave the area, the largest of which being the Zulu. There were others, but the largest of which being the Zulu. So all three of these powers are fighting for control of South Africa. You can see based on the date ranges that there are actually two sets of Boer Wars while they struggle for power. It's also important to note that based on the land that the powers controlled, the laws were different. And in British-controlled territory, all people were free. The British at this point were done with slavery. They had abolished slavery. But in the Boer-controlled states or areas, many natives were forced to be slaves because the Boers had a long-standing tradition of using slaves on their plantations. And so freedoms and laws were different depending on where you lived in South Africa. And that was a source of the tension. Well, the British continuously win these wars and they end up controlling this whole area. But for the sake of peace and negotiating treaties, they create the Union of South Africa. Now, the Union of South Africa was meant to be still in name controlled by the British, but it was ruled somewhat independently and democratically, meaning there were elections. Well, through a series of elections, the Boers won the most power within the parliament. So again, British still control South Africa, But the Boers really controlled the parliament, which also meant that they had a large voice in designing the constitution and the laws that would govern this area. And the newly written constitution established a white-run government. Eventually, this leads to apartheid, which was the legal segregation system of South Africa from 1945 to 1993, which is a great example of how something that happened over 200 years ago, so how the impact of imperialism still influences the lives of people today or in modern times. Our last case study on what imperialism looked like in the 19th century is that of China. Now, China never actually got colonized, but it fought off foreign attempts at colonization throughout the 19th century. At this time, the Qing dynasty was in power, but it was very weak from internal tensions. So tensions between different ethnic groups, tensions about modernizing versus staying traditional, and a lot of the commoners of China believed that the Qing dynasty was really just carrying out the wishes of foreign powers. Okay, that ends up being their downfall. We'll get there though. And while Europe never actually colonizes the Chinese, they do create spheres of influence, and they control these spheres of influence, meaning they control the trade of different pockets of China, and they controlled what would be bought and sold in these areas. And of course, they added all sorts of taxes so they could raise a bunch of money. Well, there was an imbalance of trade between the British and the Chinese because the British really wanted Chinese products of things like tea and silk, but the Chinese weren't that interested in European products, and they just accepted silver. The British did not like this. So what they did is they brought their opium that they grew in India, which was one of the British colonies, and they brought this opium into China as something to trade. Well, opium is a very addictive drug, and the Chinese started to realize very quickly that this was damaging their population. It was hurting society. And so the Opium Wars broke out as the Chinese tried to stop Britain from trading opium in China. The British won these wars, in fact, humiliated China by not only winning, but then demanding money for the opium that the Chinese had destroyed, and demanding control of 5 different ports along the Chinese coast and control of Hong Kong. And that the British control of Hong Kong lasted until 1997. So needless to say, the Chinese people did not appreciate the European powers interfering in their society. And the peasants become so upset, and other ethnic groups become so upset that a civil war actually breaks out. Because remember, the commoners don't really trust that the Qing dynasty is looking out for their best interests. They believe that they are a puppet government under foreign influence. And so the Taiping Rebellion breaks out, which is really just a Chinese civil war. And it's happening at the same time all of this other stuff is happening. And while this rebellion gets subdued and the Qing manage to maintain power, the Chinese people are still not happy. And so there's a secret society of Chinese commoners that get together, and they call themselves the Boxers. And they are traditionalists who fight the idea of modernizing China, and they highly resent the influence of foreigners. So they go into Beijing and start attacking foreigners and actually take several thousand of them hostage by controlling the neighborhoods that they live in Beijing. Eventually, Japan and the European powers come in to crush the Boxers. Really, it was a massacre. And so while they did maintain, the Japanese and the Europeans managed to stop this Boxer rebellion, it shows the discontent and the instability of the Chinese government. And eventually this leads to the downfall of the Qing dynasty, to the point where the dynasty system of China ends for good. And so that becomes the start of the Chinese Revolution. So that's it for these notes. As you can see, imperialism was another time of huge change in the 1900s, and it affects the entire world. And you will very clearly see how that connects and leads to being one of our causes of World War I.